The story of the Bible begins exactly where you expect, in the beginning. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God put the universe in perfect order and put the planet Earth in perfect order as well. He created the animals and the birds and the fish. God's last creation with human beings, He created the man from the earth, and He created the woman from the man. And they were made in His image. They would serve God in ruling over His planet. Everything was perfect, and there was no sin in the world. But then, the snake deceived the woman to eat the fruit, and she persuaded her husband to eat the fruit, and they fell into sin, and they lost their relationship with God. God had to make them leave the garden. They became strangers and wanderers in this terrible world. However, all was not hopeless. God in His mercy made a promise. The promise was that the descendant of the woman, her seed, one day would crush Satan's head, and humans would again be free and in fellowship with God. This promise of a Savior in the future became the great hope of all humanity. But humans still fell into terrible, terrible sin, year after year, generation after generation. Finally, God spoke to a man named Abram, and God gave him promises and told him that through his descendant all the families of the earth would be blessed. After 25 years, when Abraham was now an old man, God gave his wife Sarah a son. They named him Isaac. Isaac carried the promise that through his descendant all the families of the earth would be blessed. But it did not happen with Isaac, and it did not happen with his son Jacob, nor with Jacob's 12 sons. However, Jacob and his sons returned to the land of Canaan. This was the land which God had promised to Abraham, and it was a land that they would live in forever, God said. And so they lived in Canaan for many years. Then Jacob's son Joseph, the next to youngest son, had dreams that one day he would rule over his brothers, and they didn't like that very much. And so they, because they were jealous, decided that they would throw him into a pit and let him die. But instead, they decided to sell him for some money to Arabic traders who brought Joseph to Egypt. This is a very important part of the story, because there in Egypt, Joseph finally became the second most important person in the land. And during a great time of famine, while Joseph ruled as second in command of all of Egypt, Joseph's brothers and everybody around them were starving because there was no food. So Joseph's brothers, who tried to kill him before, came to Joseph, and just like Joseph's dream, they bowed before him. Now Joseph had his father and 70 people come to be with Joseph in Egypt, and that small group of people became a mighty nation. Then Joseph died. Then his brothers all died of old age, but there were more and more of their descendants, and they became a great nation of people who lived in Egypt. Well, the Egyptians didn't like that very much. They were very worried that these Hebrews would end up helping their enemies to defeat them in battle. So they decided to make them slaves. The king of Egypt was called Pharaoh. And Pharaoh and his advisors decided that they were going to make the Hebrews into slaves, so they couldn't overthrow them. That's exactly what happened. Oh, they treated the Hebrews terribly, and the Hebrews suffered much under their beatings. Finally, the Hebrews cried out, and God heard their cry and remembered His promise to Abraham. God raised up a man named Moses and sent Moses to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. But of course, Pharaoh said no, no, and no. So God finally, through a great miracle, punished the Egyptians for their cruel treatment of the Hebrew slaves and set the Hebrew slaves free. They left Egypt by the permission of the king himself. But the king changed his mind, what kings do sometimes, and the king decided to bring them back to Egypt. And that was a bad idea. You shouldn't break your promise with God. And so Pharaoh sent his armies to take the Hebrews back, and the Hebrews were caught at the Red Sea and didn't know what to do. God did a miracle. He opened up the Red Sea so they could walk through as if it were dry land. The Egyptians wanted to bring them back, so the Egyptian armies went to capture them. That didn't go very well. Their chariots got stuck in the mud, and they couldn't get out, and God poured out all of the water of the Red Sea on top of them, and they died. Oh, the Hebrews were so happy and rejoicing, and they sang songs of joy. Then they followed a cloud during the day, which turned into a pillar of fire at night in front of them, and that led them across the wilderness. After 40 long years of going through the wilderness, they finally came to the borders of the Promised Land. Moses appointed Joshua, his young assistant, to become the new leader of the Hebrew people. Moses went on a mountain, and he died to be with God, and Joshua became the great leader. Hebrews crossed the Jordan River into the land of Canaan. God had given this land to them, but there were people already living in cities there. But God was going to punish those people for the terrible, terrible sins they committed. And so God used the Hebrews to punish the Canaanites for their sin. The Hebrews fought many battles and won all but one of them. As they did that, they took one city after another city after another city, and sometimes they took towns and villages as well. Joshua divided out the land of Canaan among the 12 tribes of people who were descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. But their work was not done yet. There were many more cities and villages they had to conquer. Then right before Joshua died, he made the people promise that they would continue to conquer these cities until all the cities were conquered. Why were they doing this? Because God had warned them that if they did not remove all of the people from the land, those people would end up tempting them to worship idols and to follow into terrible sin. Joshua said, "Choose this day who you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And all of those Hebrews who listened to Joshua's words cheered and raised their hands in joy and pledged that they would be faithful to God. Then all of those people grew old and they died, and their children were not so committed to God. At first they were, and they worshiped God just like their fathers had. But over time, they forgot about the God of their fathers, and they began worshiping idols. And when that happened, God would send punishments. Armies would invade the land and defeat them, and then treat them terribly and make them into slaves again. And they cried to God for help, and God would hear and send to them a military leader called a judge. And that leader would lead them into victory, and they would be free from their enemies, and they would be thankful to God. But they still did not remove all the Canaanites from the land, and the Canaanites became a trap to them. They would always listen to their neighbors, start worshiping their neighbors' gods again, and everything would go back to just what it was before. And that is the story of the book of Judges. One sin after another sin after another sin. They would sin, God would judge, they would cry out to God, God would send a judge, the judge would deliver them, and then they would have time of peace, and then they would sin all over again. So this is the book of Judges, and this is the beginning of the history of the nation of Israel. If there's one thing we learn from the book of Judges, it's this: humans always fail because of sin.